That is
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I want to first welcome you all to this space with first an Indigenous peoples and land acknowledgement. The Gender Affirming Care Nova Scotia team is located in Kjipuktuk and We'kwampektik, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Our town hall today is taking place on the island of here it goes. Ktaqmkuk, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Beothuk people. I spent an hour rehearsing this and I apologize. The ancestral we further acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of NunatuKavut. These lands are governed by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which did not deal with the surrender of land, but instead recognized title and set rules for what was supposed to be a long-standing relationship between nations. We are all treaty people and have responsibilities to each other and to this land. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions for all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for us all. We also want to recognize the more than 400 years of history of communities of African descent in Atlantic Canada. As loyalists, refugees, and Maroons, people of African descent have been largely excluded from our history. And we recognize and respect the contributions of those of African descent now and historically. Now, to open this conversation, it's also essential when we discuss gender affirming care that we recognize that the medicalization of trans, intersex, and gender diverse people is also a part of a larger legacy of colonialism rooted in Eurocentrism and a Eurocentric gender binary system. Through colonialization and slavery, Black and Indigenous peoples who do not fit into cis-colonial heterosexual ideals and cisgender ideals were often attacked and targeted, and traditional understandings of gender and sexuality were repressed. At the same time, it has been Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities who have always been at the forefront fighting for queer and trans liberation. We must always keep this context in our mind throughout these conversations that we're going to have tonight. Now, I want to introduce myself. My name is Riley Nielson-Baker. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I'm a public servant, community activist, and the author and organizer of Gender Affirming Care Nova Scotia. GACNS works to encourage policy changes both in Nova Scotia but now in the greater Atlantic Canadian region. Mainly these changes regard health equity and access for the trans, intersex, and gender diverse community. I myself have my Master's of Public Administration from Dalhousie University, and I'm a current Master's of Arts and Political Science student with a focus on Canadian politics, and my thesis work studies the legal concept of the transgender person in Canada. Basically, taking how case law has viewed who is legally trans over time, and basically how and why that concept has changed throughout our history. Before we go into these conversations, I want to go over some housekeeping and ground rules. Tonight's event will go from 6 to 8 p.m. Sorry, I have a typo in here. We have 3 panelists and 5 questions. The panelists will talk for about an hour and a half on some questions that were pre-submitted and selected for thematic relevance and to really narrow down into the conversation we want to have tonight. After which there'll be about 30 minutes for questions submitted online by the audience during the event. And also if anyone in this room has a question as well. For those who are joining us online, a link was sent out via email and is also available on our Facebook event, basically telling you how to submit questions. And I have been told our camera is crooked, if you don't mind fixing the camera. It looks a little bit better. Can you lower it just a little bit? That's better. Yeah, right there. Perfect. Thank you. For those who are joining our online event, we ask that you submit your questions using the link that was sent out before the event. If there's any questions that occur during this town hall, please submit them online, or if you're in this room, please hold them to the end when we do our Q&A. Or if there's, basically, we will first take questions in person from the audience, and then we will move to online questions. We have ASL interpretation provided tonight, and we want to thank the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador's Student Union for supporting our effort to make this event as successful as possible. We would also like to thank the City of St. John's for providing this space tonight. Finally, we want to thank Rhea Rollman. Without her support and efforts, this event would not be possible, and I wanted to say thank you to Rhea before we get into this conversation tonight. I kind of want to set a baseline tone as we do when we have these conversations, so we can at least we all enter this conversation with a general level of understanding. The biggest one being, what is gender affirming care? Gender affirming care, or GAC or GAC, refers to a wide variety of medical, social, legal, and psychological interventions which are undertaken to help affirm someone's gender identity and expression. We typically think of gender affirming care as medical. We're talking human changes to our bodies, whether that's hormone replacement therapy, HRT. Those are the things that people typically think of: testosterone, estrogen, puberty blockers, as well as many surgical procedures. But that's only one piece of our puzzle, not just in gender affirming care, but in our healthcare in general. Gender affirming care also includes voice training. It includes binding. It includes makeup, clothing, pronouns, all of these things. A myriad of interventions we use to recognize and affirm someone's identity and gender expression. We're also here tonight to talk about general healthcare equity and access for our community. Gender affirming care is probably about 40% of our healthcare. We have been led to think that it is 100%, but we also have general healthcare requirements and needs that go very much unignored in our current system. Basically, can we find a healthcare professional that has ever met a trans person before, let alone knows how to practice medicine on a trans body, or knows how your hormone replacement therapy or your surgeries are going to impact your ability to access different kinds of healthcare, or just being able to not misgender you and understand your identity in any social interaction? While there's a healthcare shortage across Atlantic Canada and Canada in general, it's even more acute for members of our community, as we all know. It's rare to find anyone who's met a trans person, let alone knows how to practice medicine on our bodies. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists for tonight. Going across down the line here, first to my left is Charlie Murphy. Charlie is a longtime TUS LGBTQIA and sexual health activist currently residing in what is colloquially referred to as St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is the executive director of Quadrangle, Newfoundland, a registered charity mandated to create provincial TUS LGBTQIA+ community care center for the province. For the past 12 years, he has worked for the community through a number of organizations such as PFLAG St. John's chapter, as a peer support facilitator, as a former board member of St. John's Pride, and is currently the Newfoundland and Labrador representation for the Enchanté Network, and sits as a RAB member of the Reaching Home Indigenous Newfoundland. He is the 2021 Building Healthy Communities Award recipient for the City of St. John's as Volunteer of the Year. I next want to introduce Carson Cameron. They are a third-year Bachelor's of Science student at Mount St. Vincent University, which is in the city colonially recognized as Halifax. They want to commit themselves to research and focusing on biomolecules and chemical compounds used in hormone replacement therapy, HRT, and their physiological effects after their graduation. Carson is involved in chemistry research at the Mount and enjoys staying up to date on gender affirming care and women's health research. They are actively engaged with the Gender Affirming Care Nova Scotia as an organization developing a policy to help reduce access and barriers, expand coverage, and protect people who are transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender diverse. Finally, at the end of our panel, Micah Hollahan came out loud and proud in 2019 as a trans woman while living in central Newfoundland and has since moved back to her home of St. John's. She has not become any quieter. With a passion for transgender nonconforming education and African advocacy, Micah currently volunteers as a board member for Trans Support Newfoundland and helps facilitate the adult peer support group, as well as other organizational initiatives. Some of Micah's past volunteering efforts have been for nonprofits like Foster Families Association, Home Again Furniture Bank, and TEDx Harborside Park, as well as driving outside fundraising efforts for organizations like Quadrangle, Newfoundland and Labrador. Micah is a mother of a wonderful 4-year-old, and she currently works on the marketing communications team for Verifin as a graphic designer. Originally, when we advertised this event, we had 2 additional panelists, Denise and War. They are both unable to attend tonight last minute. They are both not feeling well tonight. Instead, we had Carson step up to sit on our panel. We want to send Denise and War good vibes and hope that they feel better as quickly as possible. Now, for the meat and potatoes of tonight. We have 5 questions that are a mix of things that were submitted by all of you guys who registered for the event, on top of basically distilling down a lot of the conversations, the themes that were really submitted by these questions in order to guide the conversation we'll have tonight. This event is designed to be as accessible to as many people as possible, really, no matter where you are in your understanding of trans health issues and gender affirming care, whether you are trans and you've been living this life for decades and you know the system in and out and what the problems are, or if you're just someone who is interested and wants to find out more about these issues. To start with the conversation, and we will go down the line for this first question and then open it up to greater conversation. We've reserved about 10 to 15 minutes per question. And that is, what is the current state of gender affirming care here in Newfoundland and Labrador? And what are the most recent developments that we should all know about? And I'll start with you, Charlie.
Sure. So I have all mine on notes because I figured if I didn't have it down somewhat, I would get lost. So what I've been doing with Quadrangle now, a lot of our outreach work has been asking questions on like what a center could do for the province, and one of those things was advocating around trans rights and trans healthcare. And what we've learned from that, besides just being an advocate.
Sorry, they would like you to use the speaker on my
Sorry. Oh, wait, perfect. So what I was saying is, in my current role as the executive director of Quad, some of that work entails a lot of outreach, finding out what extra five in the province, and a lot of advocacy and support towards to trans healthcare as well as to LGBTQ+ general healthcare. And what we've learned over the last few years was the fact that there is now not enough advocate care or understanding of providing that kind of support for our community. We know that there need a few doctors in our province that specify in our pretty much for LR. One of those doctors is Dr. Senate, hundreds of patients, clients a year, and they're currently the ones that's like the go-to point of contact for a lot of individuals in the community. So we see the fact that that's a lot of one individual caring for a population that is already underserved. So they're taking a lot of that on themselves. We're also seeing the fact that surgeries are still not allowed to be done still, even though in 2019, I remember correctly, I guess actually a bit ago, talking about the change in our policy that we don't have to go through the NH, but surgery can often offer so much to go. And so of course that was at the cost, and those individuals are also having to themselves not cover others. So we're seeing a lot of people doing funding, a lot of people doing fundraising, a lot of overall private work these surgeries are policy, and it's on the individual. Again, we're seeing that not a lot of businesses are having transitional policies in place. So these are terms like the holiday time to go to the surgery, or if that's unfortunate that you have extended holidays or overtime to do that. And then of course, just overall basic care, healthcare system. There's not a lot of mandatory training. All that is all if you wish to see training. And we know that there's a lot of free training that we taking provided by like CRC, community research centers to do very overall general who are getting met with the red tape if they want to go further during an event we had called College Politics. There were a lot of individuals talking about besides the fact that often women are really equipped to help with home replacement. There's no medical travel support. The mental health services are really inadequate. So we're seeing things like people being dead named. We're seeing people breaking trust. We're seeing left on the barrier. And so with Quad, we're trying to hopefully push as much as we can to advocate in support of changes with groups like Transplant and other allies in the province.
We're gonna switch microphones and see if that helps. Is that a little bit easier for you guys? Is that better? Yeah, that's better. If you want to pass that down. Microphone closer. Can you hold the microphone just a little bit closer? Sorry. Yeah.
All right. So there will be that would be the only opportunity in Central which include access back there because it wasn't going to be available. There was no real find it from the drive. So there's definitely an issue to not short anyways, but especially if you want to actually keep providing that in terms of readiness, certain authorities, assessors, and 3 years of jobs, we have one more so those are basically for people that can get here without involving travel. In terms of actually traveling for the surgeries, I just recently had this experience with a partner with your top surgery, so I traveled to London, and it was quite expensive. It was a cost of liposuction, so there's certainly like a medical aspect that's involved with that. And there is also like travel costs, which are incredibly difficult to get covered or get money back. And in terms of like coverage, we covered technically NCPO covered those surgeries, but they kind of shape what you're going to pay for, and especially something like breast augmentation, for instance, and excess for since 2019, but not a single person would be able to avail because the restrictions are so tight that you actually want to 18 months and have breast ablation. And I'm like, honestly, I don't think we're going to insist that you're going to have breast ablation. So it's just like, it's an archaic way to stop people from accessing this usual care. And it kind of feels disingenuous when this care is provided, but no one's actually able to access it. The other issue with travel costs is COVID, because if you get COVID before your surgery, it's canceled, and you don't get money back for travel if you didn't go traveling, right? So that's a huge issue, and that's just like a service side. We also have in pharmacy is another issue. I don't know any transplants that interact with someone in pharmacy is a struggle. I actually used to use the Ktaqmkuk for about 5 years. And I can definitely see, and I have no experience with it. We transferred during that time, and I was like 2005 to 2005. And it was always just like a woeful education system. Pharmacists can often be very asking questions. Like hormonal script, asking all sorts of weird questions about you. They're not necessary, but it's more like curiosity. I think, and that's the same with like technicians as well. So I think we get a lot more training in schools, especially in early tech school. I think one of the big opportunities is to do some training. Within those schools, there's often younger people going in and are wonderful pharmacists. You can kind of help guide their education, which knowledge, and older like pharmacists as well, a little bit more approach with asking questions such as really get something on, get something people that I yell at girls. I'm not going to beat that. And there's also like things as well, like within the schools, there's a big issue, like in our high schools. You probably heard about, there was like the recent incident of the Migrant High School. I don't want to single them out individually because that's an issue in all our schools. They're just the ones who happen to catch the light when the students started speaking up, and then the media got to it, right? But that was involved with when a trans girl was denied access to a bathroom, and the students actually started protesting it. And I remember seeing a video like the principal threatening legal action over the PA system. But ultimately, the answer was they contacted the school district, and the school district's policy was that they're allowed to use whatever bathroom, that responds to your gender, right? The school districts that they know what this policy is with. The school district said and asked, is the school district doing enough to educate all these schools on the policies and keeping them up to date? Are the schools doing enough to make sure that you're up to date with the policies? Are the teachers doing enough to be personally educated so that you're not traumatizing these kids? And another issue that I'm talking about as well is like within the shelters here, trying to figure out deny access to shelters. Even though that a lot of the shelters are getting funding by the government, which is kind of seems like a big issue that's never really talked about. This is kind of stuff that a lot of men because these people will access these shelters who don't have a voice to speak about these type of things. So that's like the first thing.
No, that's about it.
Okay, for the next question, the ASL interpreters are having a really hard time with the echo in the room. So we're gonna get rid of the microphones, and I'm just gonna ask us all to try really hard to project. If that doesn't correct the issue, I'm probably gonna switch places with Charlie, just so that the microphone on the laptop is closer for them. I do know we're having a general tech issue with the stream right now as well. And I don't really know what to do in that situation. I'm going to try to troubleshoot this real quick if you guys will give me 1 second.
Okay. I'm hoping that helps a little bit muting this computer.
It helps with the feedback issue that we're experiencing. All right. Has that helped with the feedback issue at all on your guys' end? Much better? Okay, we're going to try to continue from here. I apologize, everyone. It's a great evening to try to figure stuff out. Okay. With that, I kind of want to move into this next piece, focusing on improving healthcare access, both whether that's general affirming care or general practice, for a community that is really living in an incredibly ruralized system of healthcare. And where traveling to St. John's isn't always an option. Is there anyone who wants to take on that question first? How to pass that down? Just turn it on when you get it.
So you want to kind of
Just make sure you click it on. I just turn it on so we don't hear the passing.
Okay, so we'll talk about the issues facing kind of more rural versus St. John's and their inability to travel.
Yeah.
So I can talk about my experience when I was in Central, that was in 2019, and I had an opportunity and I asked them about transgender care there, and they were not willing to pursue that, and wait for me to leave. I, by chance, ran into some friends main call, but that would involve how they have rounds to back and forth once a month. So, I mean, that's just in terms of the one therapy period, but that I don't think our clinic is anymore, right? So there's I don't say virtually anything when it comes to role playing outside of especially looking at a place like Central where you probably may have some doctor that might be able to cover. I'm not entirely sure, but certainly not in Central. It's definitely a huge gap. And is a huge area. There's a lot of communities kind of all spread out, and you have access to nothing else. So your access to information is what you're going to engage with. So it's as bad as it is in what we just talked about, especially if it will multiply enormously in rural the further out we get.
Okay, so the microphone is not helping. We're just gonna project. We're gonna turn it off and project. We're gonna speak slowly, we're gonna turn the microphone off, and we're gonna project, and we're gonna fix this. I'm really sorry, y'all. I know, Carson, you grew up in an incredibly rural area and can speak to these issues as well.
I think the whole objective of gender care is not clinical, it's very much about to have a holistic care experience.
Project.
So when you're in a rural area, especially, access to resources are really slim. So to get even okay treatment is very hard to do, let alone treatment that encompasses everything from mental health and psychological health, nutrition, hormone replacement therapy, if that's something you were interested in, or like surgical intervention. And I can say that I'm not from Newfoundland, but I grew up in a really rural area in Nova Scotia, and understanding what it means to be gender diverse or intersex, non-binary, trans, that was hard enough for folks to wrap their head around, let alone getting good care from family practitioners when we're in a healthcare crisis. I think the best thing that physicians can really do right now, and I can't really speak on this because I'm not a physician, but if you don't have the means to provide care, at least give a referral to someone who does. You can't very well leave gender diverse folks out on their own to find someone when you're in that space, because you should know someone who can offer help. I think too, and maybe this is a bit off base, but just having educators in rural areas who are well informed on transitioning socially and also physically is a huge asset, especially in high schools and middle schools when questions like that start to happen. But yeah, just educating our teachers maybe is a really great step in rural areas, and at least supporting students navigate their system so they don't feel so alone.
I feel like, and I want to try to pivot this a little bit too, to talk about education for healthcare practitioners. And I wanted to pick your brain, Charlie, on this, because a lot of these situations that we find ourselves in where we have a lot of it is people talk about, building another network, when that's not really the answer. The answer is training the existing physicians that are already in our communities practicing to practice all of healthcare. We all have probably heard the idea that trans healthcare, intersex healthcare, gender diverse healthcare is specialty care. The idea that we are niche, that you need special training, when that's really unrealistic. And the reason that that is the narrative is that our healthcare isn't ingrained into healthcare materials when they're going through either community college or university. So how do we best encourage, with the existing healthcare system, people who are practicing already in this province to actually take up this care? And do you feel like this is an effective solution, potentially, to actually addressing limits on ruralized healthcare?
I think it, like you said, it always goes back to education. But the main thing that I always kind of run up against is the language. I don't think necessarily there needs to be maybe specialized education happening, but maybe we need to change our language the way that we're perceiving things, right? So if we look currently at what is happening in the States, abortion is still being seen as a female, battle, but that's not the case, right? Like, we know that there are trans individuals who can have kids. We know there are individuals who are not binary that can have kids. Like, it's the idea of changing that narrative around language and getting back to what are you trying to support someone in. So if we get away from saying like breastfeeding and say chest feeding, if we get away from saying female condoms and just say internal condoms. Like, it's the idea of just changing the idea around language, I think, is a huge thing. But also just getting into schools at younger ages and talking around sexual health and normalizing it into what is it actually happening? What is happening to our bodies? Not what's happening to a female body, what is happening to a body? I think that is like the most powerful thing we can start doing. But also I think we can kind of tap into a lot of the technology we have. I know we can't necessarily fly to Labrador, we can't fly people in all the time, but like there's our teleconference or telehealth, right? Like, there are ways that we can do a lot of this work to support remote and rural areas of the province, as well as those who are practicing in those areas. I know currently when we look at places like Happy Valley Goose Bay, for example, when we have practitioners going there, they could be going there for 4 months to a year based on a training period, right? And then they're going somewhere else. So then we're basically leaving individuals in these regions feeling comfortable with someone, maybe doing a lot of the training themselves, because that's what seems to be happening. The community members are teaching their healthcare providers, but then that individual is leaving, and they might be taking that education with them somewhere else. But then that individual who is trans in the community is then having to go through the same process again with a new physician, a new doctor, where if we were getting at med students who were then going into remote areas already equipped with this information, it wouldn't feel as much of a barrier to the members of the community seeking that care, because someone who's coming in to get their 1 year of being on the ground working with that basic knowledge, it wouldn't be coming from the community members themselves. So that's where I look at it, is that it's the idea of changing language, it's the idea of making sure that it's in our education system, right from elementary school all the way up to you going into post-secondary if you're becoming a doctor or nurse or healthcare provider. And the same thing with mental health. It's the idea of just looking at it at the language and taking it back to basics and looking at it, trying to look after somebody and help somebody. You should not be thinking so much of them based on their gender. It's the idea of you're helping someone with their specific need.
The only thing I would maybe add to that is, looking beyond just like the doctors themselves, but also looking at their support staff and looking at those training programs. Look at X-ray technologists, for instance, and someone that you might be right? So taking a look at those programs, especially like in the colleges, I think might be a more accessible solution. Because I think there's already some work being done within Monday. There could be a lot more, I'm sure, and the same with nursing as well. I think another thing as well is that a lot of these occupations, like as a doctor, physician, or as a pharmacist, they need what are called continuing education credits to continue and uphold their license. I think, is there an opportunity for us to have more trans-related healthcare education that involves providing them these credits, makes it a little more enticing for them to take this on?
Now, kind of focusing in on that, it kind of all a lot of these problems are really interconnected. And when we're talking about care, we know through issues of medical racism and ableism within all healthcare, I don't just want to say this province or this country, all healthcare globally, that people of color, indigenized people, and people who live with disabilities are just more likely to have their healthcare needs denied at a higher rate than their able-bodied or white counterparts. How do we then, thinking about folks who are Black, who are Indigenous, racialized, low income, or living with a disability, how do we better ensure access for them in the system as well? if anyone wants, yeah, go ahead, Carson.
Yeah, I would kind of tether myself to the last topic, and we had this conversation somewhat this morning. But just even having people from those communities train people going into medical spaces is so crucial. So instead of having someone who identifies as cis teaching on trans issues in medicine, having people from the trans community, PhD or regardless, speaking on their experience, because really that's the most important thing we can have. Beyond that, I should also note, I don't identify as a person of color or an Indigenous person or so I am not the person maybe to speak on this, but
Absolutely.
that's what I think.
Absolutely, and I will also recognize when we originally wrote this question, we did have an increased presence of people of color on this panel, and I thought about removing this question, but I think it's too important, even in the absence of people who are sick who could not be here, that we still have this conversation, and I feel like I can talk about it a lot as well. In this system of gender affirming care, there is a significant amount of gatekeeping that we all interact with. We've all experienced it. The problem is the bar is higher for people who are living with intersectional identities, whether that's living with a disability, with being racialized, indigenized, all of that. And we have to recognize, I'm pretty sure everyone who identifies as trans or under the trans umbrella in this room knows what the trans test is. The idea that you have to walk into a room and explain to someone who's typically cisgender, white, and male that you are in fact trans, and argue to them that you are trans enough in order to access this medically necessary care. Now the bar, the pass rate, the passing bar for people who are white and able-bodied is a lot lower than it is for people who have intersectional identities. Their pass bar is much higher. They are more likely to be told, oh, you don't actually need that care. They are less likely to be believed that they are dealing with a medical problem, in this case, the need to physically transition or socially transition, which we can talk about the fact that much of that is often tied to your ability or need to medically transition. With that, we have to reflect on a good portion of this struggle can be eliminated, or at least a lot of the biases that these systems introduce can be eliminated through eliminating these unnecessary gatekeeping structures. That is having to prove that you're trans enough, and instead moving towards informed consent models in which your assessor's only job is to make sure that you are understanding the options available to you, that you are understanding the risks of those options, and that you are in a place to make those choices for yourself instead of prescribing to you what you need and arguing, oh, actually, you don't need that. You don't need that. Because at the end of the day, we know when people can be told that they don't need that, marginalized people suffer, and people with intersectioning identities suffer the most. So to help address this issue, we can put the power back in the hands of the people who are trying to access care in the first place. And when we do that and have the assessor be there only as a guide instead of a gatekeeper, what we do is we open pathways for people who typically are denied this care unnecessarily and at disproportionate rates because of their identities. And I say identities because in this conversation, the intersection identity is always that they are trans, that they are intersex, that they are gender diverse. So there are always an intersection identity when we have these conversations, when we're talking about racialized people, indigenized people, and people with disabilities. In that reflection, we have to know that if we know something's going to cause an increased barrier because of someone's intersectional identity, and we know how to get rid of it, or at least reduce it, and put the power and control back in people's hands, because at the end of the day, all of these conversations, whether it's abortion, or gender affirming care, or sexuality, is about bodily autonomy, and your right to make choices about your body, and it all comes back to that. These are struggles that are all interlinked, that we have been taught are separate struggles. They're all the same struggle. When people lose access to gender affirming care for whatever reason, It's an attack on bodily autonomy that's going to come back around, and it's going to impact people who need to access abortion care. It's going to come back around, as we're seeing in the United States, potential attacks on Lawrence, which is sodomy laws, and your right to have sex with who you want to have sex with in the way that you want to. These are all interconnected struggles that we know disproportionately impact people with marginalized identities. So what can we do? We remove options for externalized people, especially people who have no connection to our community. 99% of the people who are doing these assessments are not trans. They're rarely even members of the greater 2S LGBTQIA+ community. So why are they the ones controlling whether a trans person can access care? Further, we also have these barriers that basically say, if you want to access care that you do need, you frequently have to access care you don't need. I use myself as an example. I want to access mastectomy top surgery for my own gender affirming care needs, but when I told my assessor that I did not want to go on hormone replacement therapy, I was told that I was not trans enough. How does that allow me to access care I need when I'm forced to access care I don't need? I always use the example of your appendix has burst, but we have to remove your gallbladder at the same time, even though it's fine. You can't get the problem fixed unless you fix the non-problem. And that wouldn't be acceptable, but it's acceptable for our communities because it's another way to force and remove our bodily autonomy, because then the option is either you don't access care, or you access care you don't need, and we get into issues of detransition and the studies that are coming around about that issue, and we're frequently seeing in those cases, in basically the one study that has been done on this issue, that often it was people who have been forced to access care they don't need, being forced frequently into the issue of the gender binary, which we will get into as well tonight. They're forced into these gender binary things, these gender binary boxes, and forced to access care they don't need in order to access care they do. So how we reduce these barriers and help address these disparate interactions with these systems for people of color, for indigenized people, for racialized people, for people with disabilities, for people on low income as well, is we remove the barriers, we remove the gatekeepers, and let people make their own decisions about their bodies. It's the same as abortion. It's the same as having sex in the way you want with the people you want. It's all about controlling your own body. And the way that we help fix these mismatched results is we allow people to make their own decisions and recognize that we know what's best for our bodies. And therefore we have the rights and the ability to make those choices for ourselves. Because I know, because there are no people of color on this board, like those originally intended to, I don't want to continue to discuss that question because we are not qualified to speak any further on that. I wanted to set a base tone on that question because I thought it was very important, and it shouldn't be excluded from this conversation just because people of color had to cancel. So I want to move on to one that I think all of us can relate to, and that is the current increase of anti-trans violence and hatred that we've seen. As we have seen in Canada and the West, hate crimes have increased, harassment has increased, and we know this because the stats tell us. So, how does this current climate of anti-trans backlash and really greater anti-queer backlash impact laws, policies, and practices that we would like to enact, and how do we as communities best resist them? If Charlie, you want to start off there.
This is like the one question besides the one you just mentioned that I was like, I'm not sure how I'm going to answer this in a way that I'm not going to get into a rant.
This is a rant zone.
Yeah, I'll go to from the standpoint of the stuff that I've been seeing in the States when it comes, again, to abortion, when it comes to don't say gay. We're seeing an uprise in a lot of these kind of formulated tactical approaches to coming after our overall human rights and our dignity. And I feel like how this impacts laws is we have to be even more vigilant. And same thing with policies. We need to be more vigilant of standing up together as a community when we see these happening. Even though I'm seeing a lot from the States, a lot of that can trickle in into Canada as well. And I'm sure others will speak to more about what's happening in Canada with some of the other topics that have popped up. But for me, it's the concept of really having to stand together. So if we're seeing these kind of groups formulate and more tactical approaches to come after our human rights, it's us having to do the same thing. We're going back to those same kind of riot basics of we're going to stand up, we're not going to be pushed around. But I'm fearful because, like you mentioned, a lot of those base kind of laws are all formulated around the same kind of foundation. So if one is under attack, then the others can kind of like domino effect, right? So that's where my brain goes to, is just the fear of what does that lead? If one person is saying something versus, a mass group coming after, a foundation of human rights. So that's kind of where
my philosophy is always, if we stand in we are obligated as queer people to stand in solidarity with every other marginalized group, because when they separate our struggles, that's when they're able to divide and conquer. Carson.
Yes, I'm going to try my best not to get too analytical, but I do think that they're trying to burn us out as a collective by subjecting us to the same things over and over and over again. And I think the best way to combat that is to use your community resources, however scarce they may be. Riley had written GACNS's policy because it needed to be done, and it's really unfortunate that people who identify as gender diverse have to take on those, jurisdictional political roles within their spaces when they're, having other jobs and other commitments and developing their emotional and social well-being. Like it's just a lot. So put your resources in your community to work as best as you can, like groups like GACNS and different things like that. And just make it really clear what you expect to see from them, and they can do their best to advocate on your behalf, because it's too much to expect you to do that for yourself all the time. And I'm sorry for that.
I mean, so there's lots of ways that we encounter this anti-trans backlash, even in online spaces, but one of them is there was an organization called Gender, and the idea is that it's a professional-looking organization, but the whole idea is talking about the dogma, the gender ideology, and just, a disruptive way of trying to disrupt trans progress. So you have like a lot of anti-trans rhetoric in there, talking about sex and gender. It's anti-trans information, and this is developed and polished in a way that is very professional, and it's distributed to schools, for instance. So these places are being targeted, and they're targeted with like beautiful infographics and a lot of visual aids, and it all is very real and professional, but it's all dressed in a nice way, right? Like we have kindness, which is real and genuine, and we have nice, which is a gift wrap. And when you're dealing with like groups like gender critical or Turks or other organizations like that, they dress their transphobia in niceness, and they have lots of kindness. And so it's often difficult to argue against them in that way and trying to convince people what they're doing is actually harm, because people who aren't experiencing that transphobia, not hearing those dog whistles, they don't see it. They read it as very like surface level, and they don't really absorb what is actually being said in the words.
You also have a lot of trans pain has become very profitable in the last couple of years. You have people like anyone with a hot take in a podcast. You have people like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, people like that who are pushing that anti-trans rhetoric of like doing documentaries and having a lot of money behind it. Because when you look at conversations that are surrounding being trans, being non-binary, especially in the media, that is what gets the most interactions. And so these organizations are looking for the clicks. They are looking for money, they want engagement, so they're going to drive hate to make money. We have to do a better job of communicating their actual intentions. Rather than making it about their deep-hated bigotry, we have to show and expose them that they are profiting off of people's pain. Once we start pushing that story and showing people what's actually happening, you're going to see a shift in public perception with that.
So building on this conversation, what tools do we have in our toolbox as advocates and that people in this room and online can best use to push back? Is it call-outs? Is it increased platforming of people who are speaking out against this wave of violence? Is it education? What do we think is the best options, the best tools that we have? And I'll go in reverse order this time if you want to continue.
Sure, I honestly think it's all of it. I think there is a place for call-outs. There's a time and place for education, and there's a time and place for that networking. And I think all three of those need to happen. Like, trans people can have a lot of anger because of what they have to deal with day in, day out. Anger is a very important emotion. It tells you that something is wrong. It is a great tool for detecting that and expressing that outrage, but it is a miserable lifelong companion. So it's important to use all those tools and not just your anger, or not just the education, or not, so you have to kind of use all those pieces sparingly, especially the anger, because that's something that can consume you, especially if you're dealing with fighting in online spaces and stuff like that. You really have to pick your battles, conserve your energy, show anger when it's needed, but not always carry it with you, and it doesn't always have to be the first tool that you draw.
And I think just building on what was said about networking, networking goes beyond reaching out to other queer and 2S LGBTQ2+ groups. Like, networking is also reaching out to Black groups and Indigenous groups. Like, we are all the same guy in some ways. So just using resources from other marginalized communities and really supporting each other, I think that reinforcement is going to make a huge difference in terms of what can be done policy-wise, because there are a few of us in each group, but as a collective, quite a lot, and it's going to be really hard to ignore us as a collective. That's all.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and before this panel, I actually reached out to Mike to be like, let's have a conversation about what we're going to talk about so that we're not maybe saying the same things. And this was, again, one of those questions that I was like, I don't know how I'm going to answer this, because I'm only seeing the reflection of the stuff that I identify with. So I'm not trans, I don't identify as being non-binary, I identify as being cis white, bi male. So in my newsfeed, I'm seeing, a lot of the stuff around don't say gay in the States, or the groups that are going against the 2S LGBTQI+ community, but not necessarily specifically trans groups. So when that was mentioned to me today, I was completely blown away that I did not hear about that group, I did not see any of that stuff, and it does look very professional. That sells. When you can package something in a way that people can believe it for face value, that is extremely dangerous. But I think as a whole, our communities need to be engaging with each other more. We need to be sharing those pieces, not just on our Facebook posts, but being did you hear that this is happening? Or another good example, we had a church group actually trying to pop up here last year, and they were very much about conversion therapy. And so the fact that we had group members being did you hear about this? It's out of one of these churches that is being occupied by, or used by another group here. What's on the go? And the community started actually talking with each other and engaging with each other to see what is going on, how can we stop this? It's not going to be helpful, it's problematic. And the community was able to make sure that didn't propagate, that didn't show up. But I think that we need more of those pieces happening. We need to have more in-depth conversations. We need to be meeting more on a regular basis, not just online, but just having conversations like this, so that people can have that, the toolbox to kind of pull from, or that person to talk to, but I don't know all of the pieces around this, but do you know? So we can actually engage more with the information, with actual knowledge, and kind of displace that misinformation and that completely not true guided intent of what these other groups are trying to do within our school systems, within our public systems. We need to just kind of communicate more within ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of add to that as well. I think another major gap that we find within our own trans community is how a lot of the members of our community will look at people who are detransitioning or retransitioning. These are people who are often still feel connected to the trans community sometimes in some way, because it's not always just about a complete regression. Sometimes it's just the next step in a gender journey. These people are often weaponized against trans people, so there's a lot of fear and misinformation. But if we start excluding people because it makes us uncomfortable, then we're really just kind of replicating whiteness in our trans community, and we have to stop doing that. We have to stop being afraid of the idea that people want to detransition if they want to. That's their decision, that's their body autonomy, and these people are often excluded in the cis world and in the trans world as well. So it's doing a lot more research and information on detransition and retransition, and making sure that you understand it's not just about that. There's lots of reasons why people go through this next step or this process. Gender is such a confusing and wild journey. There's not just a start and one stop and then you're done, right? Sometimes there's many steps, and sometimes you pivot and change direction, and it's important to recognize that and respect those people in their decisions.
And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because currently Quad put in an application for wage federally around a lot of research, and one of them was around detransitioning and what that looks like, because that's not necessarily being talked about in that kind of data collection way here, and it needs to be. We need to be kind of the front and center of our community here in the province.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know detransitioning is not having an idea and getting it wrong. Maybe that was totally affirming in that time. Gender is so flexible and changes throughout your life, and I think ideally queer spaces in general are just places you can come to explore those things, and we should be safe for people to stop by and try to figure out who they are. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I highly recommend, if you guys haven't heard, the work that Ross McKinnon is doing at the University of Newfoundland. If you want to learn more about issues surrounding detransition and the research that is really the pioneering research that's being done, Ross McKinnon and their team is doing amazing work. And I highly recommend a close friend of ours, Gabe, also works on that project. And it's some really exciting work. Before we continue this conversation, I want to allow everyone to have a 5-minute water and tea break. So we're just going to take 5. Whether you're in the room or on stream, if you want to just take 5 minutes, get some water, use the bathroom, stretch your legs. We're just going to take 5 minutes, and then we'll be right back to continue this conversation.
I'm so glad you brought your cat. That's amazing.
I know, it's so hard.
The second I saw him.
No, very serious talk, and I'm just smiling.
Oh, there's no way this is a little more central for the people who are doing the ASL interpretation. So we're hoping that this helps make it a little more smooth, but we've learned our lesson, and in the future we will do it differently. So we thank you for everyone's patience in this. Moving back into these conversations, we just had a discussion about the way to manage trans backlash and what we can do as advocates. I want to try to open up to a more positive conversation and talk about how we can support, whether you're a parent or a friend or a partner or someone who just wants to be better. I typically don't use the word ally. That's because of something that a really good friend of ours, Munsu.ca, who if you haven't checked out their work, I highly recommend it, always talks about how, who allowed you to use the title of ally? Is that a title you gave to yourself? Because ally in this world, and I don't just mean the trans world, I mean the world, in this global society, ally is not a noun or a title to be bestowed. It's a verb. And it's something that you have to actively engage in and be active in everything you do and recognizing not just what you are experiencing, but being conscious of even the stranger on the street experiencing anti-trans or anti-black or anti-indigenous or ableist, whether it's violence or just discrimination. Ally is a verb, and how we can best, in this conversation, support our children, our friends, our partners, our fellow community members, both in this increased hate world, and we'll start with this conversation there, and I will work this side again with you.
That's maybe you could pass on to someone else's for a moment.
Yeah, I would say like let people be. That's my main thing. Is just we're looking at a lot of when we're looking at schools, for example, youth are going in and experiencing everything from what a textbook is telling them to what the kid on the playground is telling them or talking to them. And I feel like that is a way we can kind of support more. Just let people be. If someone wants to come to school in a dress, like maybe we should be teaching the students that are there that it's just an article of clothing versus a parent being very concerned with their child wearing an article of clothing that they want to wear to school. When I look at how I count my friends personally, and I'm really happy that how you define an ally, because that's actually what we have in a lot of our workshops too, is you have to put action behind that. You don't get that title. That's something that's given to you, that's something that someone says you are, but it's followed up by you actually doing something. So if you're seeing someone getting picked on, if you're seeing that oppression, that aggression, that those animosity towards a marginalized population or underserved population, it's standing up. And maybe that's an awkward and uncomfortable situation where you're at your workplace and someone is saying a really derogatory term or a joke, and you have to basically say like, that doesn't really cool, it doesn't really sit well with me. And you're both in that awkward moment, right? Like you're both feeling that tension. If you're telling the person, that wasn't cool, it was not cute, that's not petite. And then you're also having to that other person is also automatically going to have that reaction of defense, right? So you're both in a really awkward situation, but those moments need to exist so that we can actually do better, and not just say we're going to do better. When I look at my partners or what have you, is listen. If they're in a workplace environment and they're telling you it's not really feeling safe, it's not really feeling the best, being the person to say maybe you need to talk about their policies. Maybe you can ask your workplace what are their policies around X, Y, and Z. So I think it just comes back to communication. Communication is always key, and allowing people to just be themselves and put more of that onus on society to correct society, not the person. Again, if they're wanting to wear makeup, let the person wear makeup. It's society's problem to deal with the fact that makeup is just makeup. Anyone can use it. It's it's a product. It's not gendered.
Yeah, actually, I can hop back in now. Thanks for starting me off. I think when it comes to educating people close to you, allyship is it's a very interesting thing, right? something like allyship again is approach, like it's your actions, right? And it's consistent actions. But like, is allyship when it costs nothing to you? But like, what are those moments when you're actually risking something? Like even if it's hard, you stand up to perform allyship. I feel like that has a lot of value. People say they're ally when they really have nothing to risk when it comes to that. And also, I found the easiest way to kind of connect with, like, especially with like people when I'm trying to explain like my transition and how I understand until I was 34, and I didn't find out that's my 34. I'm old. I'm like the oldest baby trans you'll ever meet. So a lot of what I say, talking to other people and trying to explain stuff, and they're so afraid of getting something wrong when they're talking to you. And everyone, when trans, like, from my trans, everyone walks on eggshells around you. They're so afraid of making mistakes. And I just try to be around like, I didn't know, and there's a reason you didn't know. You know, like, this is systemic erasure. We were never set up to be taught this. So this is why you don't know. And that's okay that you don't know, as long as you're willing to learn. And I think that's usually makes it a lot easier for them. I think my own mother was like a challenge. I teach her how to accept being wrong, which is a fun experience. But it really got a lot easier for her when I accidentally misgendered someone once, and I corrected myself, and she could see me as more that I wasn't this infallible person. That like we actually make mistakes too, and seeing the steps that we take when we make those mistakes helped guide her on what to do. Right? Like that made her more comfortable. So I'm just seeing you as more human in more ways than just like your identity, but just as this like infallible, like higher knowledge of this like enigma. You really just gotta make them realize that like you're making mistakes too. Like things that I learned the first year of my transition, there was a lot of things I don't believe that I believed then that that have completely changed my perspective. It's a growing knowledge, and they have to be okay with maybe getting things wrong sometimes. But you also have to give them that space to make mistakes. Obviously, if it's overwhelming or consistent, like you have a right to be upset. But approaching those situations with compassion versus anger, you're always going to have a more upset person. Obviously, that takes a lot more work on your end, so you kind of gotta gauge the value for yourself as well, right? So it's like, is it worth it for me to expend this emotional energy, this emotional labor, to work with this person to get them where they are, or do I feel like they need to do more of this work on their own and they can? And it's just a case-by-case basis. So just explaining to people that like, it's okay that they don't know. They were raised to not know.
Yeah, and I think like just reflecting some of the things that you've already said, a great gift you can give to gender diverse folks in your life, I think, is just putting in your own work. These people are already reasonably very tired, have answered a lot of questions, and some questions, being rooted in traumatic experiences, it's really hard to explain your entire transitional journey to everyone you meet who doesn't understand your community every time you meet them. So going home and doing as much of your own research as you can, and then reflecting on those ideas with folks in your space who are gender diverse is, I think, very helpful. But maybe I'm wrong. To me, it seems like very good.
I always use the concept of when you misgender someone, it's always better to make a quick correction in the moment than it is for you to come back later or in that moment make a huge deal out of it. Because I ask people, when you make a huge deal out of it, is it about that you have upset me, or is it about you? Is it about your discomfort with the fact that you've misgendered me or someone else? Or is it about the impact you had on me? Because if it's about the impact you had on me, when you make it about you and what you have done, that's not about me, that's about you.
Yeah.
And in that moment, when you misgender me or someone else, quick correction, they, she, them, is better than, oh my God, I'm so sorry, and asking for someone's forgiveness. Because if you're looking for someone to say it was okay, it's not okay. And you need to be comfortable with the fact that it's not okay. In that moment, make a quick correction and move on with your life. And like you said, I misgender my friends all the time on accident. It is something that we all mistakenly do. And what we do is fix it in the moment, or if you're corrected for making a mistake, okay, and move on. Oh, that person uses they or pronouns. Okay, thank you, they. It is that simple, because ask yourself, like I said at the beginning of this, what's turning into a much longer statement than I thought it would be. are you worried about quelling the emotions of when you ask if it's okay or apologize? Are you looking to quell their emotions, or are you looking for confirmation that you're not a bad person in the moment? Because misgendering happens. What matters is your intent in trying to correct the error. So when you make it about you, we know you made it about you, and that makes us more uncomfortable than if you just, oh shoot, I'm sorry, move on. Don't make it about you.
And maybe at risk of people misunderstanding what I've said,
No,
because
not
I'm
at all.
worried. Absolutely use folks in your lives as resources, but if you can Google something like how hormone blockers work, instead of reaching out to trans folks in your life and doing your own research, I'm sure that takes some of the stress away.
Now, there is a risk there, though, that I
Gotta
always
get
say this.
information.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and this kind of leads into another piece that I wanted to talk about, where there is so much information, and by information I mean disinformation out there, that you really don't know when someone who is well-intentioned is Googling these things, is going to find out, which is why I always say if it's like a simple question, like how does hormone blockers work? That is something that you can easily go and find online, and you're probably not going to run into anything that is misinformation that is not obviously misinformation. Which is why in these conversations, we don't answer questions like that. What we talk about in panels like these, in situations like these, is what are the things that if you did Google would send you down the wrong rabbit hole. And I would like to use that framing to talk about trans kids and the parents of trans kids, in the sense that when we talk about parents, and when we talk about people in general, there's usually two issues that come into play when there are concerns about transness, and that's fear, like you mentioned, or concern. And when I say concern, it is concern of a parent who wants the best for their child, and it's just been led down the wrong path of what is actually good for their child. And really need people, when we're having these conversations, again, it doesn't work everywhere. Some people are into the piece of shit, and that is just the reality. But if you find someone who is not just trash, and that is clearly just coming from a place of fear or a place of concern, frequently with parents, where they're like, I just want the best for my child, and this is what the internet told me is not good for my child. Recognize where people are coming from, and making sure that we are giving them space to express their fear to a certain degree, of course, because when you let that go too far, that's where you get violent gates, and that's where you get anti-trans vitriol that destroys lives. Now, in that consideration, what resources would you guys recommend from a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective? What resources would you guys recommend that, whether it is parents or kids or people who are just trying to learn more, you can recommend themselves, absolutely, but where would you tell people to look if they're looking for accurate and unbiased information?
I would say transgender is one, Quadrangle is another, P-Flag is one, intersection from one university. There's so many like peer support groups and connections. Beothuk Canada. Oh yeah, our handbook on our website. Yeah, which actually was reviewed by Transgender as well. I think what else? There's a lot of local groups, and then there's a lot of international groups as well. But I would say we're looking more like local groups, Transgender, EDEL, P-Flag, Quad, Planned Parenthood. I don't know if I can say anyone say.
I mean, you also have, like, there are certain, let's say, Reddit, for instance, there's a lot of subreddits that have a lot of quality information. I remember seeing a thread that someone made a map and pinned every single informed consent clinic in Canada and the US. So that's huge, right? So that's something I try and pick and choose what I find is like incredibly valuable, someone putting a lot of work into, and then try and distribute that information. You kind of like learn from other people's experiences as well. Like we run a Discord channel for Transport NL, and then whenever someone new is coming in, we only normally met once a month for a peer support L group, but like these conversations are continuing throughout the month and between people, and they're getting the support they need, and not necessarily just from like us as board members, because we're not a large organization, we can only do so much. So it's so amazing that we're seeing like members of our community kind of step up and help, guide like newer members of the community. And I just want to kind of hop back a bit, because you talked a bit about like fear, right? With how parents are being manipulated. And I'm a parent myself. I don't know if my kid is transgender. He hasn't decided, but he likes his pronouns, and we're rolling with that so far. But I also work for an organization that is a tech company for anti-fraud, fraud detection, and anti-money laundering software. And one thing that we learn when it comes to fraud and when people are getting hacked is that it's not normally, you always see on the internet how people will hack through a computer, but that's not how it works. People are hacked. That's how we access people. So they'll send phishing emails, for example, and they're preying on your fear, and always in times of panic is when people are most easily manipulated. And I think that happens the same with bigotry. You know, once you're approaching these situations and you're using fear as a tool to twist people, like they are so easily latch onto that because fear is such a strong emotion that can push you and make you make poor decisions. So it's important to recognize and talk and kind of take that approach with that type of thing, that you realize that it is fear, that you are being manipulated by this idea that something horrible is going to happen to your kid. And there's a lot of resources that kind of go through that process as well, especially for parents. And we have a lot here at TSNL too. We try and amalgamate all our resources on our site, which is desperately needed for an update, but we're working towards it. But yeah, there's a lot of, even if it's just the simple application stuff of going through those processes, but also the information. There's educational seminars, there's webinars available, people are always running free webinars online. There's lots of ways to find this education. I think it's okay to ask someone if this is an okay resource. You know what I mean? Hey, I'd like to do my research. I'm wondering, is this a good one? Or even better, do you have one on hand that you know that you can recommend? And that way you're just asking them to provide a link at that point, not so much go through an explanation for yourself and answer your questions.
I think when we're looking at stuff like that, even outside of the trans community, just the general 2S LGBTQI+ community, the fact of someone doing some research on their own, then coming back and engaging in a conversation, at least you can have a conversation with them, right? If someone's just coming and asking a blank question, okay, you're wanting information and then you're gonna leave. But if we're gonna sit down and actually discuss some of these topics, we're actually gonna have a discussion. There's gonna be that exchange of meaningful conversation.
I always try to think too, and this is something that people struggle with all over the world regardless of the topic, that it's okay to say I don't know and just leave it at that. A few weeks ago, after the decision in the United States regarding Gender Affirming Care Nova Scotia was the organization in Halifax that organized a rally in support of abortion rights and access, recognizing that while I am a person who's assigned female at birth and would need to access these healthcare services, while I'm Canadian and I've been back for years, I was raised in the United States. My conversation about abortion, healthcare, and access is a US-centered argument. So I went in and I said, I don't know, and I'm not the one to talk about it. I know that that's happened at our events, that's happened in events here, and we just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask a question. So I just want to allow anyone, if there's anything that, a question that you've had or something that you would like us to expand upon in the remaining time, this is the time to do it. And we're going to start with people in the room before I check the online link to see if any of our audience submitted any questions. And if you're uncomfortable asking in front of everyone, the link went out in the email. If you RSVP'd on the event using our Google form, and if you're uncomfortable standing up in person and asking, you can feel free to type that out on the phone. Because we recognize that social anxiety is a thing. Not seeing any hands, and just because I'm going, oh, go ahead.
But when you were speaking about resources a few minutes ago, there's another organization here in town which helps two-spirit or women and gender diverse persons who are involved in the incarceration system with the Phi Society. We have a couple of two-spirit people working with us, one trans person, myself. And we make ourselves available to try and answer the questions or find resources as needed.
Yeah, so the question was more of, I'm just letting the ASL interpreters know because they can't hear you, so I'm just translating to them so they can translate to everyone else who requires the ASL interpretation. The question was actually a statement. The woman in our audience works for the Elizabeth Fry Society, and she's talking about how it is another resource that people can access, whether they are two-spirit, trans, or trans-feminine, or non-binary, that they can access this as educational support. I did a lot of work with Fry in Nova Scotia when I worked for the department.
Also trans-masculine people.
And trans-masculine people. I apologize. I did a lot of work with Fry when I worked for restorative justice issues. So I didn't actually know they had a presence in me, so that's good to know.
Where do you?
Side note, not to distract, if you want to come, we're having a roundtable discussion tomorrow. If you want to talk to Leah about it, if Fry wants to send someone, if you want to talk to her.
We don't have time to get into that right now.
No, completely understand. Is there anyone else in the room that wants to contribute to this conversation or ask a question? It's not a speak now or forever hold your peace. If you have a question after I read the online question, we'll come back. Not seeing any hands. We have a question submitted online from Mason, and Mason asks, you know Mason? Mason asked, how do you propose to attract and retain physicians knowledgeable in trans care to Newfoundland, especially within rural areas such as communities within Labrador?
May I?
Go ahead.
Okay, again, I'm full of flaws, as people do know. But I know that Quadrangle University has recently adopted a pilot program wherein students from their school are reserved X amount of seats at down, they promise to go back to Quadrangle. So just even working with medical schools that train these folks and give precedence to rural students for the first time ever would be such a cool thing to see moving forward.
Do you guys have any?
I know from personal experience, a previous partner of mine went through Monday, and they actually do offer a lot of incentives to do the residency out there, not necessarily stay. I'm not really sure what they're doing in terms of once they're graduated, but you get, there's a lot of benefits of doctors that do make it appealing for them to actually start the residency out in rural communities. They're more likely to get access to do different types of procedures that normally they would never get to do in like St. John's, because you're kind of a one-stop shop, right? And you also get like several $1,000s of a break on your student loan for each year that you're working on here as well. So yeah, it's like, I think almost around $8,000 or something. It's quite significant. Yeah. If someone wants to fact check me and correct me, I'm totally okay with being wrong. I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
I don't really think I have much more to add to that, because my thoughts with it is we just need to figure out, find a way to get more doctors and healthcare practitioners out in remote areas, whether that be physically in new clinics, new walking clinics, new opportunities, or with telehealth. So yeah, I would just be like finding different ways that we're not currently availing of that other provinces might be. So like looking at like Halifax or Nova Scotia, I could say, or looking at places like New Brunswick, where they might have, they have remote areas as well. I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I'm raised in Indian Harbour, Penisco, so like it's an hour to Sobeys. But the idea of looking at other provinces and seeing like what are they doing in the remote areas, like how can we adopt some of those practices, how can we move them here, and what tweaks we might have to do, because we are much larger and our province is dispersed a lot more than say Nova Scotia.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that we could take advantage of is the options that telehealth provide us. Because the reality is, in a lot of these remote communities, it's physically incredibly difficult to provide people with the resources that our governments currently have, and there's a larger conversation that should be had about making amendments to the Canada Health Act to provide increased federal health transfers for doctors and other healthcare practitioners in rural areas. And I think that's a conversation that provinces with high ruralization should start to have with the federal government and banding together. If you have incredibly high ruralization, you should be getting increased health transfers to help combat the fact that it is more expensive to run by those healthcare in those provinces and in those areas. Now, with that, telehealth provides an incredible advantage in some healthcare cases.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
no,
especially gender affirming care. Gender affirming care would have such a large positive impact by further integration of telehealth. Now, it does telehealth doesn't solve all healthcare issues generally, absolutely not. Some people need to physically go see a healthcare practitioner, and that's the reality. But when you're trying to access gender affirming care, unless you're getting your surgical assessments, no one needs to physically be there to see your body. Unless you are literally in the room getting top surgery, or bottom surgery, or tracheal shave, or any other surgery, they don't need to physically see your body. Providing telehealth options and providing increased infrastructure for telehealth options, which comes hand in hand with telecoms ruralization projects, which is a problem we have in Nova Scotia, and I know it's a problem that exists here as well, making sure that these rural communities, telehealth is great, but if there's no internet to access telehealth, then you're wasting your time and resources. As we've said before, a lot of these issues are interconnected. Treating rural internet the same way that we treated rural electrification 80 years ago should be a priority, not just for everyone, but for trans people in rural communities especially, because our healthcare can be so much more easily provided. On top of that, just providing training to as many healthcare practitioners as possible on trans health, because it's not specialty care. If we just ingrain these issues into general healthcare instead of making it an elective or one week tacked on to the end of one of your courses, people would enter and actually know how to practice medicine. Because the idea that they can go in and just not know how to practice medicine on an entire section of the population and just deny you healthcare is ridiculous. And if they could do that for cis people, there would be outrage to just deny you healthcare. And they do, to be fair, they do that to people with disabilities. But because disability is another marginalized community, they can just be easily ignored by those in power. Want to speak some more on that?
Yeah, maybe it's slipped my mind, but like for rural communities, the hub is your high school. Your bus takes you as far as where their high school is. So even bringing a practitioner or a nurse practitioner to a high school could be absolutely valuable. I know a lot of schools in metro areas have school nurses, so it would be great if rural areas would have that option also, especially for gender affirming care.
Or even just expanding who can become a qualified assessor beyond healthcare practitioners. Your school counselor should be able to be your referrer. Social workers. There's no reason why we have to be limited to surgeons, endocrinologists, and doctors. In some provinces like Nova Scotia, some NPs, but typically only NPs can be assessors. There's no need for this to be such a limited and such a medicalized list. By just increasing the pool of who can become assessors and who can prescribe and guide gender affirming care, you decrease a lot of the problems. Because suddenly, instead of having 2 people that can do this in an entire region, you suddenly have 10 people. There might not be doctors, but they are just as qualified to provide a recommendation or guide care or provide therapy and just create a more holistic experience. It doesn't just have to be doctors. I want to open it back up to the floor because that was the only question that was submitted online. I'm refreshing to make sure. Yeah. Is there anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'm just kind of wondering in terms of like, say, education, especially in rural areas of that, and maybe, folks that's not just from Scotia, that, like, what can we do to get that as a, like, Transit Part now provides training to nurses that provide training to nurses of that, but if we have to get an uptick, especially, we're a volunteer organization, full-time job, and it's hard to, the amount of requests that we get for training that they want for free, that is completely uncompensated, which means like we're having to take, just for like the presentation, having to take time out of work, to provide this training to our sectors, and let's say they even allow that, and sometimes we'll say like, we'll do it for free because we need to get information out there, but it's like, how can, if we have some resources, we have some education, we have some knowledge that can be regular, like what ways can we kind of build that up?
Okay, I'm going to, again, repeat it for the ASL members. This question has a few parts. The first part is how do we ensure the uptake of education within the healthcare practitioning field on these issues, as well as a lot of the times that we're being asked to provide this education or these resources, it's typically for free. Or it's typically, if not for free, at a cost to us, whether that's monetarily, temporally, or mentally. So I have actually a pretty spicy take. Spicy for me. Why are we allowing any healthcare practitioner to practice medicine who cannot practice medicine? Now, I'm not saying that this is a short-term option, but it is one option to ingrain trans health and queer health education into upcoming healthcare practitioners' training. It's another, a good 2/3 of the issue is the people who are already practicing in the field. We need to be requiring this for the re-up of licenses. If you are unable to practice medicine, be that a nurse practitioner, a mental health professional, a psychologist, or a doctor, or a surgeon, then why are you allowed to practice medicine if you can't practice medicine? And I know that's a very spicy take, especially in a healthcare doctors and healthcare provider shortage, which is why I don't think it is an immediate solution, it is a 5 to 10 year solution. The other piece in my eyes is core funding. I'm assuming that Newfoundland and Labrador is exactly the same as Nova Scotia, where there's no core funding for any 2SL organizations.
You are bang on the money.
There's no core funding provided by our provinces. How, in the year 2022, can any province claim to be in support of our communities and not provide us a single cent of core funding? That's how we address issues of providing these this education and these resources for free. I would love to go out and do trainings all across Atlantic Canada if I had core funding and someone was paying me. And that's a big conversation too, where marginalized people are constantly asked to educate and be in these spaces for $0. I always tell people, and it shocks them, that this is not my job. I work full-time job in government. This is my second full-time job that is completely unpaid. It is volunteer. And part of that is my privilege that I have the financial stability that instead of working a second paid job, I have the financial stability and financial privilege to be out here and take 4 days off of work, paid because of my union, and fly out to a different province to do something like this. That's my privilege as someone who is financially stable. How we get that, and further, is have organizations like Quad and Trans Support Newfoundland and GACNS and Halifax Pride and St. John's Pride and all of us. Why is our provinces say we support the community and they show up at Pride, but refuse to give us a single cent? Ask that of your government why that they are allowed to march at Pride, whether it is a political party or the civil service. And I say this as a civil servant whose civil service is not providing a single cent to my organizations in my province. Why are you showing up at Pride and calling yourself an advocate or ally or in favor of our communities and then starving us? Because this advocacy work, as I taught human rights foundations, I teach human rights foundations and got to teach lectures. And the question that I always give to students is, how do you make a living in advocacy work? The joke is that it's starvation work, because it is starvation work. And how do you make a living is you tell your governments to pay you, because it's their obligation. If they're